Welcome back to another episode of the 1.2 podcast. How you doing today, Jack?
Doing well, doing well.
Very good. Very good. So, as we come into the holiday season, this is kind of the holiday marathon. You've got Halloween or Reformation Day, as we Protestants like to call it. We've got Thanksgiving, then we've got Christmas, and coming up we have a lot of traditions. So I'm going to try to play a clip here real quick. I'm gonna share the screen and see if you can hear this. Tradition, 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 tradition.
Traditions, traditions. Without our traditions, our lives would be as shaky as as a fiddler on the roof.
There we go.
Look at you, technology.
I know. Fantastic. So, as you may have assumed, that is from the musical Fiddler on the Roof. You ever seen that?
Have not seen it.
Okay.
I've heard of it.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. So the basic premise, that's kind of the opening number from the show. And the story of Fiddler on the Roof revolves around that gentleman, Tevye. He's a Russian Jew in the Tsarist Russian country before the revolution, things like that, and everything is based around tradition. At that time, the Jewish people in Russia were not treated great, right? But they had established themselves, and they were able to get by because they stuck to their traditions. Everybody had their roles. Everybody did, certain things, and it helped them, even though life was so chaotic and hard, that it kept them continuing. And the premise of the musical is that as his daughters come of age and are ready to marry and things like that, some of them start bucking some of those traditions. A pesky thing like love gets in the way of the matchmaking process, right?
Naturally,
right. Instead of marrying the butcher, who is a Russian and wealthy and respected in town, she wants to marry, I forget if he's the cobbler or the shoemaker or something that is much less, but she loves him, and, so Tevye has to, the father has to come to grips with that, and wrestle with that. So the question I have for you is traditions. What role do traditions play in your life? And do you believe it's a good thing or a bad thing to have these traditions? Even when, how they started, or why they started, might be unknown, or even questionable. Why do we do it this way?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. I think overall, well, I'll back up. Traditions, I think, are very important. And I think overall, well, they play a very big part in my life. And overall, I think it's a very good thing. But it depends on what it is, and I do think it's okay to question, mm-hmm. Certainly. And we should question why we do things. But generally, to me, everything in my life, my family's life, is guided by those. I'm trying to think of specific traditions, but under that general word, I think everything's guided by traditions. And
Let me jump in real quick.
Yep.
What is because I think, I get the sense you're a very routine
yes,
oriented person
Mhm.
and family. When does a routine become a tradition?
You're asking
Right.
some
When does it-
hard-hitting questions.
When does routine transcend routine and become tradition?
This is a totally unscientific, but the first thing that comes to my mind is when it's been something that's been passed down to you.
That's a good start. I think a lot of people would agree that something that your parents or grandparents or whatever, something that has been multi-generational is a good
And
way
I
to
think,
start.
it's not organic. It's not something that I've created or my family has created, and perhaps those trend and become traditions.
Mhm.
But at this point, I would suggest they're routines until I do think it's important. There's an element of time to it.
Mhm.
And I think, I don't know, I think that's where I land. It's got to be something that's passed down.
Right.
And maybe to qualify as a tradition, naturally, it's something that is unquestioned.
Sure.
And that's not to say that you can't question it moving forward, but maybe it's something that is just so unquestioned, so routine,
Right.
that you don't even think about, why do we do this or why do we do that? And it doesn't have to be these big guiding points in your life. I think it can be a tradition to go to this person's house on Christmas every year.
Right.
That
Right.
maybe it doesn't fall under the definition of tradition, and maybe that's a routine, but if you've done it for 30 years.
Right. Right. So I mean, that comes right up to your dad's run streak, right?
Yeah.
That now you have assumed, right? So has that transcended into tradition yet? That one takes a little bit more work.
Yeah. I think so. As we talk about examples, I'm perhaps getting a finer definition of what a tradition is.
Yeah.
And that's probably the purpose of an exercise like this, right?
Right.
And so there's the element of time. I think we meet that with the run. It's on 31 years. But
Right.
I also think it's when it transcends just the
The action itself.
correct and becomes something more. So, running every day, I wouldn't say is a tradition.
Right.
That is a routine. But
Right.
what the run has become and the impact it has on his life, my life, and everyone's life, not everyone, but people
Right.
outside of the person and people doing it,
Right.
it's
Right.
I think qualifies.
And perhaps the annual, fundraiser,
Right.
the New Year's Eve day run or something along those lines. Maybe that's closer to becoming tradition.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. So
What do you?
yeah,
Where are you on that?
it has to have a greater purpose than a practical application, right? It's something that, yeah, like you said, we do without really questioning why. And it doesn't have to be daily, it doesn't have to be, and I think it can be something that's not generational yet. What comes to mind is, oh yeah, every time my friends and I, from high school meet up, we always, fill in the blank. We always eat at this one place. It's a tradition. Or we always, play this one song. It's a tradition. At the end of every West Virginia University football game, they play Country Roads. It's the tradition. Things like that. I don't know if it has to be multi-generational, but I think that's a strong indicator that it is a tradition.
Yeah,
Because
because
it's something
it's
that you-
survived.
Right. And I think there's an expectation that it will be passed down,
Sure.
whether it's passed down yet, right? I know, when we first got married, my wife and I talked about, should we start any Christmas traditions,
Hmm.
right? And we had a good one going for about 6 years. It was literally the only thing that could be a constant, which was getting some not some Dunkin' Donuts, some Krispy Kreme donuts. On
That's not a
Christmas.
tradition.
It didn't last because we couldn't find a Krispy Kreme, but yeah, we actually have very few traditions in our house, just because we've moved around so much. We aren't as close to family and things like that.
And that's what I thought of immediately when you asked, how important is it in your life? I mean, I live where I was born,
Right.
and I'm raising my family, so I think there's a natural element of a homebody, and I'm closer to the way and the ways that I was born, and
Right.
those sorts of things. So I think there's an element of that as well.
So do you think of, big picture, let's apply this broadly. Do you think that our country, our society, has lost its desire for carrying on traditions? Do you think there are fewer traditions now than there were 40 years ago?
Probably.
And maybe that should be clarified as to meaningful traditions.
Yeah.
Is it a tradition if it's something as simple as, oh yeah, every Christmas we get Krispy Kreme donuts?
Hmm.
I mean, that's kind of like just a thing, right? But it doesn't really provide any actual value to our lives. And the whole purpose of the song at the beginning, tradition. I'll read some of the words from the beginning. So Tevye says, because of our traditions, we've kept our balance for many, many years. Here in Tevka, the town, we have traditions for everything: how to sleep, how to eat, how to work, how to wear clothes. For instance, we always keep our heads covered and always wear a little prayer shawl. This shows our constant devotion to God. You may ask, why did this tradition get started? I'll tell you why. I don't know, but it's a tradition. And because of our traditions, everyone knows who he is and what God expects him to do. So it's, it gives them this guidance. It gives them this stability. And it seems to me as though we've lost an element of stability in our country.
Yeah. So I think and I'm glad you read that, because that's where I was heading. To me, traditions, as I think about a definition or kind of a framework of it, I think of family and faith
Mm-hmm.
as kind of the foundation of a tradition. Like, that's where my traditions come from.
Right.
And I think overall, it's hard to speak on the past, having not lived in the past.
Right.
But I think there's been a breakdown generally in society on both of those accounts. There's been a breakdown of the family, and there's a breakdown of faith. And I think that they're stronger families and stronger faith, no matter what it is,
right,
would do our country better. And I do believe that there has been a breakdown on both of those fronts, and we would be stronger if we focused more on family and faith.
Mm-hmm.
And in turn, we would see a return to the, more more traditional way of living. And I don't mean that in any particular way other than say traditions, you know.
That's interesting. An interesting phrase now that you say it in this context, right?
Mm-hmm.
Going back to a very traditional way of living, because that implies there's quite a few traditions. It's interesting. It was the same word, but I don't necessarily apply it the same when I think of
Right.
what are your traditions versus this is a very traditional way of doing things or a traditional way of life. They seem to be different.
They seem to be different. And, you know, I'm not suggesting, I think I'm asking you and our listeners to broaden, you know, that phrase and let's look at the semantics really and what it actually is. You know, we say, let's go back to the old ways, the traditional ways.
Right.
You know, I'm not suggesting that, you know, we should, you name it, any old school traditional thought, you know, that my wife should stop working and be the homemaker. If she wants to do that, fine. But I'm not saying that everybody needs to go back to that. But
right.
But there's an intent. I'm asking for an intentionality behind what we're doing. Right. And when I say, you know, go back to a more traditional way of living, it's taking your traditions and putting them at the forefront and living based on that.
Right. Right.
Because I think you're right. I mean, if I say, look, we need to go back to a traditional way, like, oh, he wants to go back, he wants to take away all of.
Right. No, there's, and you know, that's one question though, is we talked about questioning traditions. It's okay to question a tradition. Why do we do things a certain way? But how do we balance that with retaining the value of some of those traditional ways of life or traditions that bring that stability? And you know, of course, Fiddler on the Roof is such a famous story because it examines that tension, right? It examines that tension of, you know, this is how we've always done it. This is what keeps us going. This is what keeps us together. This is what keeps us thriving. This is what keeps us happy. This is what keeps us grounded. But why do we do it? What if I want to marry this other person who I actually love? Well, that's not what we do, right? And you see him grappling with that throughout the story as his foundation becomes questioned. And for the first time, it's you know, there's pushback and things like that. And it's a wonderful show. There's one song in particular, it's called "Do You Love Me?" and it's where Tevye he goes to his wife because they were an arranged marriage, right? And he just asks, do you love me? You know, it's like they had never even wondered, never even asked the question, right? And of course we want to promote love in marriages, right? We want to love the person that we marry and not have that just forced on us and picked out for us and things like that. And he comes to this sort of realization and this sort of questioning. But at the same time, you know, at the end of the show, his whole life has essentially been upended, right? And we see a lot of lives upended in our country, I think, because of people not just questioning, but pushing back directly for almost no reason. So where do we draw that line between it's okay to question tradition versus we're just throwing it out because it's not explained directly?
Well, I think that's the distinction for me is the reason behind why you're doing what you're doing. So I think traditions become traditions because they've been unquestioned, right? And I don't think that means you can't question them. It's fine to question them, but what I'm asking or suggesting is that should be the tradition should be the framework for how you make decisions. And it needs to be at the center of that decision-making process. And I used the word before, but there has to be some sort of intentionality to why do I do this? Why do I live my life this way? Why do we do this? And again, that you're questioning it, but you're questioning it because you're thinking about it.
Right.
I don't think it's okay to set aside traditions and just do what you want because you feel like it.
Right.
I think you need to question the unquestioned. Okay.
Sure.
This is how I do something. Maybe why do we do that? Maybe we shouldn't do that. But it's not just set aside without any reason.
Right. I think there's an element of hubris or pride to question traditions. Again, not saying we can't do it, but I think our generation, I'll use that loosely. Let's just say the last 50 years.
Yeah, we're not. Don't put me and you together.
When I was a kid, we didn't question anything. But there's an element of, and I'm curious as to how we've gotten this way, but sort of the pride it takes to say, I know this thing has been done for 500 years. I know better. I'm not going to do it. Right. That takes a lot of, you have to have a lot of conviction in yourself, right? To say, I'm going to take a look at this thing that has been done for 500 years, 1,000 years, and I'm just going to do something different because I think they were all wrong.
And I agree with that. And it's exactly where I was going. And I think it's a good full circle kind of realization as we discuss this today is there is a quote from Tony Dungy. Tony Dungy.
Yeah.
He had a leadership book that he built his teams on, and he wanted, the way to build a good team was they developed a motto. It's not about me.
Yeah.
And that became kind of our wrestling team's crying call, our motto.
Right.
We had shirts made, and we all bought into, a common goal. We didn't care about, bumping up a weight class, whatever.
Right.
But I think that goes back to how something becomes a tradition. We use the run for an example, how it impacts more than just those direct actors. Right. And so that's when we're questioning or perhaps deciding to change traditions. I don't think it's enough, and I don't think it's appropriate to have, kind of that singular mindset of, well, I know better than this.
Right.
It has to involve everyone that's involved.
Right.
And so it becomes more than just you, and the people that are impacted by that tradition, I think, can collectively work together to perhaps question it and develop something new. But I would suggest that it shouldn't be about a single person, because I do think that comes across as arrogant and self-serving. Right.
Yeah. I'll use one last example. So I go to a church that has only been around for about 10, 15 years.
No traditions.
and we are not affiliated with.
You're non-traditional.
We're non-traditional. We are non-denominational, right? Which has an element of non-tradition to it, right? And there's no higher structure. So what I mean by that is, if there is no governing body.
You have no pope.
We've got no pope. We've got no presbytery. We've got no synod. We have no higher governing.
Do whatever the heck you want.
Body. Exactly. Right. And so the question is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because it's very non-traditional, and there are, I think, risks on both sides, because let's say you belong to a church that has a higher body. Let's say you're Presbyterian.
You can say, you can use me. You
I,
can
I,
use.
well, I don't want to pick on Catholics too much. But so
We've had enough this week with the Al Smith dinner.
That's right. That's right. Orders come from above that says this is our stance on a position now, or this is how we're going to do things now, and you're sort of forced to accept that. Okay, I guess so. And I know there's some local autonomy provided to a lot of
Well, you could just spin off your own church, and
that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
There was someone who did that at one point, I think. Right? There's a famous person.
We're coming up on a day that we celebrate that. So then the question though is so what happens if a new rule or something is imposed from above that you disagree with, and you're kind of stuck with it though because you're denominational or you're Catholic, right? But then we have the risk, let's say a church that's brand new, and let's say it starts going off the rails, right? Let's start some church leadership for whatever reason just decides to take it in a direction that is I hate to call it heretical, but let's just say that you disagree with or whatever it is. There's no rails. There's no higher authority. If there's disagreement within the church, let's say they split on an issue. Let's say the church elders can't agree on something. There's no guidance for that. There's no group of or body that they can go to and say, well, this is how we've always done it. This is how we've always resolved this type of thing. This is our official position. We've been studying this, for the last 500 years or whatever, and this is the position that we've come to. I think of these different conferences that they used to have, and I mean these people would gather from this congregation from across the world, and they would come together and they would write down their theses, and they would write down their the catechisms or whatever it is. They would have all this thought that went into it, and they come to a conclusion. Whereas you have a church that's 10 years old, and someone says, "Hey, I've got this new idea. I just read this verse again, and it just popped into my head, and I think this is what we should do." There's really no guardrail against that. So it's I can see the value of traditions that can keep you aligned, but it does become difficult when you disagree with those traditions. And so how to balance those two things becomes very difficult.
Yeah. And I think you've highlighted several examples. I would push back a little bit on the guidance portion though, because I do, even without some hierarchy above you, I do think you are guided in a couple of ways. One, you collectively believe in the same thing.
Right.
And maybe not a pecking order, right?
Right.
But you collectively are guided by one thing.
Yep.
And I'm pointing up for a reason. And then at the same time, because of that collective belief, you all are guiding each other.
Right.
Right. If someone, I'll use your church for an example. If someone comes up with this idea or interpretation that has never been thought of or done before, that may be fine. And let's say it's maybe I won't use your church as an example, but let's say a church similar to yours.
Right.
But let's say it's a completely outlandish interpretation and is going to lead to something destructive, right?
Right. Right.
The group think and the collective, embodiment of the membership isn't going to allow that to happen.
Right.
Someone comes up with this crazy idea, they're going off on their own, and they're not, I would think there's no following.
Right.
And that certainly isn't to suggest that doesn't happen. I mean, we've certainly seen examples of I'll just say crazy things happening and everybody buying into that. And it can be very dangerous.
Right.
That groupthink mentality, and you get the wrong person in charge who can manipulate that. There's the recipe is there, but I do think there's a collectiveness that can help guide more appropriately.
Right. Yeah. And what comes to mind, is the Bible even instructs us to test all things through Scripture. And so when you're pointing up, and that's why I ultimately am comfortable going to a church that I go to that's only been around for 10 years, because, we hope that we have enough wisdom, discernment, and through prayer can discern if something does not line up with the Bible and things like that. But it is interesting, and it's very different from how it used to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
It used to be, well, what church do you go to? Oh, the one my parents went to. And that was it. That my dad was a high school teacher and taught psychology, and he used to ask, kids, so, what are you? I don't think you could do this these days, but
Probably
he would say, what do you believe? He'd say, well, I'm a Christian. Okay, well, which denomination? I'm a Methodist. Why? Well, my mom and dad go to the Methodist church.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with their teachings? Do you have you read what their beliefs are? No, not really. And now that's a little unfair because they're high school students and can't expect them to be digging into things too closely. But at the same time, it does show you that element of structure and tradition that wasn't questioned. And I think we do see a lot more nowadays of, especially when kids are getting out into the world. I say kids, but people in general, I think there's a lot more mobility, even geographically. I mean,
Yep.
I look at where I've lived in my lifetime, and I'm only, mid 30s, and I've lived in 5 different states and moved around a lot and all those things. And so I think that happens more often. And I think that does tend to lead to a lesser traditional approach to things.
Yeah. I can't argue with any of that. I think that's a nice bow on our conversation.
Yep. So do you have any fun traditions with your family? Christmas?
Now, my mind is kind of blown and tired right now on what a tradition even is.
Fair enough.
I would say, it's a lot to do, family gatherings.
Yeah.
That is the most traditional thing that I say we would do, or, go to Christmas Mass. And
right.
Again, that's founded in faith and family, right?
Yep.
I mean, it
certainly comes to mind to me as well, going to the Christmas Eve services and things like that, and the candlelight services and things like that. So
Christmas Eve Mass, I could tell you every song we sing. Yeah.
Yep. So, all right. Well, you enjoy your traditions, and hopefully we can start passing on some of those traditions again.
Yes, sir.
Till next time.